Picture a digital dashboard. Right in the center of the screen, there is the shining, triumphant number 37.
Yeah, and that's not just some random score, you
Right.
know,
It is Saudi Arabia's global ranking out of 193 countries in the 2023 Global Human Development Report.
which is huge. That number firmly places the nation in the elite, very high human development tier.
Exactly. It signifies a society that has, by almost every traditional metric, just conquered the hardest hurdles of national growth.
Right. It represents this massive, undeniable accumulation of health, wealth, and education.
And when a nation crosses into that top tier, it usually signals a stabilizing of prosperity.
Yeah, you generally expect the surrounding data on that dashboard to reflect a pretty unified story of success.
But then you look slightly to the right of that glowing 37.
And that's where things get complicated.
Very complicated. Right next to it, there is a plunging bright red arrow. And right next to that arrow is the number minus 52.
Minus 52, just a massive drop.
Yeah. When the statisticians at the United Nations introduce just one additional dimension to their calculation.
A dimension they call planetary pressures.
Right, planetary pressures.
Yeah.
When that is added, the entire narrative just fractures.
Saudi Arabia's ranking doesn't merely dip. I mean, it suffers a statistical cliff drop,
It instantly plummets 52 places down the global ladder to 89th.
which is just wild to see on paper. The visual of that dashboard is jarring because it forces this complete reevaluation of what modern progress actually costs.
It really presents a profound paradox, How can a country be simultaneously succeeding at human development and, well, failing at planetary sustainability to such extreme degrees?
That is the exact tension we need to unpack today.
Welcome to today's deep dive. We're thrilled you're here with us.
We really are. And if you are joining us today, you are likely someone who doesn't just want the headline right.
Yeah, you want to understand the actual mechanics underneath that headline.
Exactly. So our mission for this session is to meticulously unpack this specific, fascinating data paradox.
We are going to look under the hood of a nation that has engineered an extraordinary human development miracle.
And we are going to audit the ledger, keeping track of it all.
Just to give you a quick roadmap of how we'll navigate this, we are going to guide you through 4 distinct layers of data from the report.
Right. First up, we will examine the classic Human Development Index, or HDI. We'll trace that staggering growth curve from 1990 to today,
Then second, we will analyze the Gender Inequality Index.
which has this crazy structural earthquake in the data right around 2013.
Oh, that chart is unbelievable. Third, we will explore the Gender Development Index to weigh the current complex realities of male versus female economic parity.
Because there's a lot of nuance there today.
So much nuance. And finally, we will confront that red arrow.
The planetary pressures adjusted HDI.
Right, to understand the deeply entrenched ecological challenge. So I want you to keep one overarching question in mind as we wade into these numbers.
And what's that?
What exactly is the true cost of rapid national prosperity?
That's the perfect framing. Because to fully grasp the sheer velocity of that 52-place drop-off at the end, we first have to understand the height of the mountain they've climbed.
We really have to map the foundations of this prosperity, and that foundation begins with the classic Human Development Index.
Right. And to appreciate the scale here, we probably need a super brief primer on what the HDI actually is.
Yeah, let's do that, because historically, economists judged a country's success almost entirely by its GDP.
Right, gross domestic product. If the GDP went up, the country was winning.
But in the 1990s, the UN realized that raw economic output doesn't necessarily mean citizens are actually living good lives,
Exactly. So they created the HDI to measure 3 human-centric dimensions.
which are a long and healthy life, access to knowledge, and a decent standard of living.
It was a huge philosophical shift. It was the global community saying, we don't just care how much money is in the national vault.
Right, we care if your people are surviving infancy. We care if they are sitting in classrooms and if they can actually afford to heat their homes.
And that philosophical shift provides the exact framework for understanding Saudi Arabia's modern trajectory.
So let's look at the historical data curve, starting back in 1990.
In that year, Saudi Arabia's HDI score was 0.670.
Okay, let's contextualize that 0.670 for a second. What did the rest of the world look like in 1990?
Well, the global average HDI back then was 0.608.
Okay, so Saudi Arabia was certainly ahead of the global mean.
They were, but they were essentially a developing nation steadily finding its footing. They were not yet in the upper echelons of global prosperity.
Right. Now trace that line forward 33 years to 2023.
That score of 0.670 has surged to an impressive 0.900.
Wow. a jump to 0.900. That represents a 34% growth in the index value over roughly 3 decades.
It's massive.
A 34% overall increase in the fundamental metrics of human existence across an entire national population.
And the acceleration is really the key factor here, because over that exact same 33-year time frame, the global average HDI only grew from 0.608 to 0.756.
So Saudi Arabia didn't just maintain its lead over the global average.
No, they widened the gap significantly. They pulled away from the global mean at a highly accelerated rate.
Which makes sense because you cannot execute a 34% increase in national human development without moving a massive amount of Earth.
Right. And in this context, the Earth being moved is pure economic capital.
Exactly. We have to examine the third pillar of the HDI, which is the gross national income, or GNI.
Because the financial reality underlying this human development curve is just staggering.
It really is. Looking at the 2023 data, Saudi Arabia's GNI per capita sits at $50,299.
But we need to clarify how that specific number is calculated, right?
Ah.
Because it's not just a raw currency conversion.
Yeah, that 50,299 is measured in 2021, purchasing power parity dollars, often abbreviated as PPP.
Which is such an important distinction.
It is. For those trying to visualize what PPP actually means on the ground, think of it as like the shopping cart equalizer.
Oh, I like that analogy.
Yeah, if you have 50,000 US dollars in New York City, it buys a certain amount of groceries, housing, healthcare.
Right. But if you take that same $50,000 to Riyadh, the cost of living is fundamentally different.
Exactly. Purchasing power parity adjusts the income data to reflect what that money can actually buy within the local economy.
It levels the playing field so we can compare living standards accurately across borders.
Which makes the data even more impactful, you know? Adjusted for local purchasing power, that $50,299 per person is immense.
Especially when stacked against the global average GNI per capita.
Right, which is a mere $20,327.
So we are looking at a baseline wealth that is roughly 2.5 times the global average.
And the data shows it actually hit a recent peak of $51,431 back in 2022.
It's incredible. And when you have an income base that is 2.5 times the global average, you aren't just participating in the global economy.
No, you have access to a fundamentally different set of national tools.
Exactly. Having that much capital acts as the foundational propellant for their Vision 2030 National Transformation Plan.
It's the financial muscle required to fundamentally reshape a society.
The financial muscle is undeniable, absolutely. But economic history demands a pretty severe caveat here.
Right, the resource curse.
Exactly. Raw wealth, particularly wealth derived from natural resources, does not automatically translate into high human development.
We've seen this so many times. There are numerous examples globally of nations that sit on massive reserves of oil, diamonds, or rare earth minerals.
And they generate sky-high gross national incomes.
Yet their populations suffer from abysmal life expectancies, systemic illiteracy, decaying infrastructure.
Because the wealth gets trapped.
Right. It pools in the accounts of a ruling elite, or it just gets absorbed by massive state bureaucracy.
And it never trickles down to build a neighborhood clinic or fund the local primary school.
So the sheer existence of the money doesn't guarantee the application of the money.
Precisely. The GNI of 50,299 is merely potential energy.
And the HDI score of 0.9 Holizo is the kinetic energy.
Right. It is the proof of what happens when that wealth is actually deployed into the social fabric.
So the central question for this next phase of our analysis is exactly how Saudi Arabia converted that massive capital reservoir into tangible human outcomes.
Let's trace that conversion process. Because wealth is completely meaningless if it doesn't extend the physical lives and enrich the minds of the citizens holding it.
How efficiently did this system translate 50 grand a year into human longevity and intellect?
Well, let's look at the health dimension of the index first.
The primary metric here is life expectancy at birth. And for Saudi Arabia, the 2023 data places this at 78.7 years.
A life expectancy approaching 79 years comfortably exceeds the global average, which currently sits at 73.4 years.
But a static number in 2023 doesn't really reveal the true scale of the state's intervention, does it?
Not at all. We have to look at the delta, the change over time. In 1990, the life expectancy in Saudi Arabia was just 68.9 years.
That is a staggering shift. We are talking about adding nearly a full decade, 9.8 years to be exact, to the average lifespan of a citizen.
And in just over a single generation.
Yeah. Right. Think about what that actually requires on a logistical level. Adding 10 years of life expectancy to millions of people isn't achieved by simply telling people to eat better.
No, it requires a monumental deployment of capital into physical and operational infrastructure.
And the logistics of that achievement are profound, especially when you consider the geography of the nation.
Yeah, we are not just talking about building advanced hospitals in dense urban centers like Riyadh or Jeddah.
No, achieving a national average of 78.7 years requires establishing a resilient healthcare matrix that reaches across vast, arid, geographically isolated regions.
It requires establishing cold chain logistics for vaccines out in the desert,
Right, training tens of thousands of specialized medical personnel.
fundamentally altering public sanitation networks.
And the data provides specific proof of how deeply this healthcare matrix penetrates. Let's look at maternal mortality.
Yeah, that's a crucial metric.
It is because maternal mortality ratios are often considered the ultimate stress test for a nation's healthcare system.
Right, if your hospitals are failing, mothers and infants are usually the first to show up in the mortality statistics.
Exactly. And the global data on this is highly revealing. In 1990, the global average for maternal mortality was over 365 deaths per 100,000 live births.
Which is high. And Saudi Arabia, even 3 decades ago, was outperforming that baseline, sitting at 29.2.
But the progression since then is what really solidifies their HDI score. By 2023, while the global average had dropped to 216.
Saudi Arabia had driven their number all the way down to just 11.1.
Wow. Driving maternal mortality down to 11.1 deaths per 100,000 births proves that the system isn't just focused on extending end-of-life geriatric care.
No, it is actively protecting life at its most vulnerable inception points.
So the wealth successfully bought time. It bought a decade of life.
Right.
So the inevitable next question is, what does the state expect its citizens to do with that extra time?
And that transitions us perfectly to the knowledge component of the HDI, which is measured through 2 distinct educational metrics.
Right. Expected years of schooling, or EYS, for children currently entering the system.
And mean years of schooling, or MYS, for adults aged 25 and older.
So let's start with the youth. The expected years of schooling in Saudi Arabia is currently sitting at 16.9 years.
And to really frame that 16.9 years, we must look at the global average, which is 13 new years.
Right. A global average of 13 years essentially gets a student through primary and secondary school.
They graduate high school, and the structural expectation basically ends there.
But Saudi Arabia is projecting an educational pipeline that requires nearly 4 additional years.
Yeah, a child entering the system today is statistically expected to remain in a classroom through a 4-year university degree as a baseline societal norm.
That's incredible, but what about the adult population? Because you can't just educate the youth and ignore the current workforce.
Very true. The mean years of schooling for adults sits at 11.6 years.
Okay, so that indicates that the older generations have already achieved a solid baseline of secondary education.
Right, but the most critical insight in the education data isn't that static average.
No.
No, it's a recent, violent upward spike in the trend line.
Oh, I was looking at that specific data point in the report, and it jumped off the page.
It really did.
In 2022, the expected years of schooling didn't just inch upward. It experienced a 7.5% spike in a single year, leaping to that 16.9-year mark.
And a 7.5% single-year increase in a national demographic metric of this scale is highly, highly unusual.
What does that actually point to?
It points to a systemic, aggressive policy mandate. It means that the state suddenly absorbed tens of thousands of students who might have previously exited the system.
So they expanded university capacities and just altered the whole cultural expectation of when formal education concludes. But I have to challenge the underlying premise here. Let's look at this critically.
Sure.
Does keeping a massive segment of your population in school for nearly 17 years automatically guarantee a thriving, innovative society?
That's a fair question.
Because you can use that massive GNI to build pristine, state-of-the-art university campuses. You can mandate that everyone attends.
Right.
But if the curriculum is misaligned with the actual needs of the global private sector, or if there simply aren't enough high-level jobs waiting for them when they graduate, aren't you just creating a highly educated, deeply frustrated demographic?
Yeah, we've seen degree inflation cause massive youth unemployment in other nations.
Exactly.
That is a highly valid critique, and it really highlights the central risk of rapid educational expansion. Creating intellectual capacity without creating parallel economic opportunity is a recipe for social friction.
Right.
However, the data surrounding this educational push suggests it is a highly calculated defensive strategy.
Defensive how?
Well, the Saudi state is acutely aware of its macroeconomic vulnerability. Their immense wealth is currently derived almost entirely from subterranean resources, hydrocarbons.
Which are both finite in volume and increasingly precarious in a global market pivoting toward a green transition.
Exactly. So the foundational strategy of their entire 21st century economic model relies on replacing subterranean resources with above-ground resources.
They must replace oil capital with intellectual capital.
That's it. The 16.9 years of expected schooling is a deliberate attempt to mass-produce a domestic knowledge economy.
But whether the qualitative nature of that education translates into actual market innovation, patents, tech startups, diversified industries, that's a complex challenge.
Yeah, that'll take decades to fully evaluate.
Mhm.
But the quantitative commitment to keeping the population in the learning pipeline is undeniably evident in that 7.5% spike.
They are essentially trying to build a new human-powered engine for the nation before the old fossil-fueled engine becomes obsolete.
And they're using the profits from the old engine to fund the construction of the new one.
It's a race against macroeconomic trends, and the education data shows they are really accelerating their pace.
They definitely are.
So we have established the impressive peaks of this development mountain. We have a life expectancy nearing 79 years and an expected education pipeline of 17 years.
Right.
But averages are notoriously deceptive.
Oh, absolutely.
Averages can act as this statistical blanket, covering up glaring, painful disparities within a population.
Yeah, if a country possesses staggering wealth, it is entirely possible that only the urban elites are living to 78 while rural populations suffer.
Exactly. It is possible that only the top 10% are going to university, dragging the average up, while the lower quintiles are completely left behind.
So to truly evaluate the quality and fairness of this societal structure, we have to peel back the averages.
Which requires us to look at a modified metric called the Inequality-Adjusted HDI, or the IHDI.
Right.
And I find the methodology behind the IHDI to be brilliant in its simplicity.
It really is elegant.
It takes the exact same data we just discussed, health, education, standard of living, but it applies a fairness penalty.
Right. If a nation's health and education outcomes are distributed perfectly equally across every single citizen, the IHDI score matches the standard HDI score.
But as internal inequality rises, if the rich live longer and the poor die younger, the IHDI score drops further and further below the standard HDI.
And the UN data regarding Saudi Arabia's internal equality reveals a really surprising narrative here, particularly for a nation built on immense centralized wealth.
Let's examine the inequality in education metric first. The data shows that Saudi Arabia's internal inequality in education is only 12.8%.
And let's give the listener the global baseline for comparison there.
Okay.
The average penalty for educational inequality globally stands at a massive 21.5%.
Wow, so Saudi Arabia is vastly outperforming the global mean.
Vastly. It demonstrates that access to that 16.9-year educational pipeline is distributed with a high degree of uniformity across its socioeconomic spectrum.
That is significant. But what about health? Because the ability to access life-extending medical care is usually the very first thing to fracture along class lines in wealthy nations.
Right, but the health data is even more striking. The inequality in life expectancy in Saudi Arabia is a mere 5.1%.
Wait, 5.1%, just 5.1.
Yeah, 5.1%.
We really need to pause and absorb the implications of that number. Are you saying that the statistical gap in life expectancy between an ultra-wealthy citizen in a Riyadh penthouse and a middle-class citizen in a smaller province is practically non-existent?
That's exactly what the data implies.
That defies the standard economic logic we see in so many developed nations where your zip code often literally dictates your lifespan.
It does. I mean, the global average for inequality in life expectancy is 12.9%. So Saudi Arabia's 5.1% is a phenomenal outlier.
Yeah.
And it forces us to draw a specific conclusion about the nature of their state apparatus.
Which is what?
To achieve a 5.1% health inequality across a geographically massive nation, encompassing dense cities and remote desert communities, that requires more than just throwing money at the problem.
Right.
It requires a staggeringly effective level of centralized logistical execution.
Because you can't buy a 5.1% inequality rate. You have to engineer it through nationalized healthcare systems, standardized clinic protocols, and massive infrastructure deployment.
Exactly. It tells a story that counters the usual stereotype of resource-rich nations.
Instead of that $50,000 GNI acting as rocket fuel that only launches a few luxury yachts into orbit,
Right.
it has functioned as a genuinely rising tide, lifting millions of basic vessels.
He really reveals a distinct social contract. While income inequality, the actual distribution of raw cash, is notoriously difficult to equalize in any capitalist framework, the Saudi state has chosen to heavily socialize the foundational elements of human existence.
Right, by ensuring that almost everyone lives to the same age and has access to the same baseline schooling, the state effectively buffers the society against the worst, most destabilizing impacts of economic disparity.
They've engineered a very high, very solid floor for human rights in terms of health and education.
Okay, so we've established that the class divide in health and education is remarkably narrow.
Yes.
But historically, when analyzing the demographic data of this specific region, the most glaring divide hasn't been about socioeconomic class.
No, it hasn't.
It has been about gender. For decades, the divide between men and women in Saudi Arabia was a defining narrative of their global perception.
Which brings us to the most dramatic, visually striking curve in the entire UN dataset.
And we're looking at the Gender Inequality Index, or the GII.
And this specific index measures the human development costs of gender disparity. It evaluates three key areas.
Right. Reproductive health, empowerment, which includes political representation and secondary education, and labor market participation.
Right. And it is important to note that a higher GII value means higher inequality. In this index, you want your score to be as close to 0 as possible.
Okay, I want you to visualize this line graph in your mind. Imagine a line that is stubbornly, statically high, hovering near the very top of the chart for over a decade.
It's just flat. It's unyielding.
Right. It represents a deeply entrenched societal structure, and then suddenly, the floor falls out.
The line drops off a cliff.
It plummets toward the bottom of the chart.
And the historical data maps exactly to that visual. Let's look at the year 2012.
Okay.
In 2012, Saudi Arabia's gender inequality index was 0.749.
And to put that figure in its harsh global context, that score placed them at 163rd out of 164 countries measured by the UN at the time.
The inequality was profound, systemic, and seemingly immovable.
163rd out of 164. They were quite literally at the absolute bottom of the global barrel regarding gender parity.
But then we look at the data for the very next year. In exactly a 12-month span, the data shifts with a velocity rarely seen in demographic tracking. In 2013, the GII dropped from 0.749 down to 0.309.
Wait, the index value more than halved in a single year.
Yes, in a single year.
That doesn't happen organically.
Yeah.
Statistical indicators of a population of millions don't just cut themselves in half without a massive, real-world structural earthquake.
And the UN indicators point precisely to the epicenter of that earthquake. The sudden drop was driven by radical shifts in political empowerment and labor access.
Let's examine the metric for the share of parliamentary seats held by women.
Okay, if you track the data from 1990 through 2000 right up to 2012, the number is a flat 0.0%.
Wow, 0%.
There was zero representation at the National Legislative Advisory level.
A total systemic lockout from formal political influence.
Then, in 2013, the data instantly jumps to 19.9%.
Instantly.
And it has remained rock solid at that exact level, hovering between 19.8 and 19.9% every single year since.
Because in 2013, a royal decree fundamentally changed the composition of the Shura Council.
Right.
And the Shura Council is the formal advisory body that drafts and reviews legislation for the king. The decree mandated, from the top down, that women must hold 20% of the seats.
With the stroke of a pen, 0% instantly became 20%.
We should note the global context here just to maintain perspective.
Sure, the global average for female parliamentary seats is currently 26.5%. So, while Saudi Arabia executed a historic instant leap from 0, there is still statistical room for growth to meet or exceed the global baseline.
That top-down decree is so fascinating, though, because it challenges the standard Western assumption of how social progress actually occurs.
How do you mean?
Well, in many Western democracies, moving women into government and the workforce happened organically over decades. It was driven by grassroots movements, civil rights struggles, generational cultural shifts.
Right, slow legislative grinding.
Exactly. The data curves for Western gender integration are slow and sweeping.
But the Saudi data reflects the exact opposite mechanism. It reflects the sheer leverage of an absolute monarchy over human development metrics.
The state decreed the change, and the data responded with a vertical line.
Yeah. However, the political shift in the Shura Council was really only half the equation. The other half, the half that fundamentally altered daily life for millions of citizens, was the labor force boom.
Let's look at the female labor force participation rate, the LFPR. This tracks the percentage of women who are actively employed or seeking employment.
In 1990, female labor force participation was at a dismal 14.2%.
Just 14%.
Right, and over the next 2 decades, it barely crawled upward, hitting just 18.5% by 2010.
So the vast majority of women were entirely excluded from the economic engine of the country.
But as the policy reforms of the 2010s accelerated, removing restrictions on female mobility, allowing women to drive, and dismantling structural barriers to workplace integration, the numbers just skyrocketed.
By 2023, female labor force participation had surged to 34.6%. Going from 14% to nearly 35% participation in a condensed time frame is hard to fathom logistically.
Like massive.
Imagine a society where the fundamental physical makeup of the workforce changes that drastically. We aren't just talking about changing a spreadsheet here.
Yeah.
We are talking about millions of women who previously were legally or culturally barred from the office, the factory floor, the retail space, suddenly becoming commuters, earners, and managers.
And the logistical friction of that shift must have been immense. It requires physically retrofitting office buildings, overhauling human resource policies, changing corporate cultures, adapting public transportation.
It is a tectonic optimization of a society's productive capacity.
They essentially flipped a switch that activated half of their population's economic potential.
And the numbers prove that the switch stayed flipped. By 2022, the Gender Inequality Index hit a historic low of 0.219, continuing its downward momentum.
But this brings us to an incredibly important, highly nuanced point. The 2013 breakthrough was massive for opening the doors. But opening the door to the workforce is not the same as achieving parity within that workforce.
Right. Having a job is not the same as having economic equality.
Which brings us to the third layer of our analysis, the Gender Development Index, or GDI.
And it is crucial to understand the difference between the GII and the GDI.
Yes. The Gender Inequality Index we just discussed measures the loss of potential achievement due to inequality. The Gender Development Index is a direct comparison.
It acts as a scale weighing the actual human development outcomes of women directly against the outcomes of men.
Right. It calculates an HDI score purely for the female population and a separate HDI score purely for the male population, and Pritzker ratio.
So a GDI score of exactly 1.00 would mean perfect statistical parity between the genders.
Exactly.
So where does Saudi Arabia stand on this comparative scale in 2023?
In 2023, Saudi Arabia's Gender Development Index sits at 0.931.
Okay, 0.931.
And this ratio is derived from a female HDI score of 0.855 compared to a male HDI score of 0.910.
How does that ratio compare to the rest of the world?
It is slightly below the global average GDI, which is currently 0.955.
Interesting.
Yeah, this indicates that despite the massive historic leaps in workforce participation and political representation we just discussed, there remains a noticeable structural gap in the ultimate human development outcomes between men and women.
And this is where we uncover what I believe is the most fascinating contradiction in the entire data set.
Let's break down the underlying factors of that GDI score.
Let's compare the education data directly against the income data. Remember the expected years of schooling you discussed earlier?
Yeah, that impressive 16.9-year national average.
Right, the pipeline designed to build the new knowledge economy. Well, when you split that educational pipeline by gender, the results are startling.
How so?
Women in Saudi Arabia actually have a higher expected years of schooling than men.
Really?
Yes. The female EYS is 17.9 years. The male EYS is only 16.4 years. Women are statistically projected to spend a year and a half longer in the educational system, accumulating more formal intellectual capital than their male counterparts.
So they are heavily out-indexing men in educational duration.
Heavily. But then you turn the page and look at the income data. The gross national income per capita split by gender.
Okay.
The female GNI per capita is a roughly $20,287. The male GNI per capita is nearly $69,767.
That is a staggering disparity. Men are earning nearly 3.5 times more than women on average.
And this is the paradox I want to dissect. If women are spending significantly more time in the educational system, if they're statistically more highly educated on paper,
Right.
how do you reconcile 17.9 years of schooling with earning roughly one-third of what the men earn? How does that math work in a modernizing economy?
Well, the math makes perfect sense when you view it through the lens of a society caught in mid-stride during a massive transition.
Mid-strive.
Yeah, the disparity isn't necessarily a failure of the current policies. It's a reflection of the lag time inherent in structural economics.
Okay, explain that.
Consider the timeline. The doors to higher education opened for women much earlier than the doors to the labor force. Women have been entering universities and accumulating degrees for years,
Right.
but the labor force doors only swung wide open recently, resulting in that LFPR jump to 34.6%.
Ah, I see. So the pipeline of highly educated women is completely full, and it has only recently begun to empty into the actual job market.
Exactly. And the crucial factor is where they are entering the job market. You can pass a royal decree that instantly mandates women are allowed to work in corporate offices.
Right.
What you cannot mandate is the instant manifestation of a generation of 45-year-old female CEOs, senior heavy industry engineers, or executive finance directors.
Because the male workforce has had decades of uninterrupted advantage to entrench itself in the highest-paying, most senior tiers of a hydrocarbon and state economy.
Exactly. So millions of highly educated women are pouring into the workforce, but they are entering at the ground floor.
They are taking entry-level or mid-level positions, which naturally carry lower salaries, dragging the female GNI average down to that $20,000 mark.
The 3.5x income gap is the statistical shadow of past policies. It is the necessary lag time between a legislative reform and a structural economic reality.
Because it takes 20 years for a 25-year-old female graduate entering the market today to climb the corporate ladder and command the $69,000 salary that her older male counterpart currently earns.
Exactly. The GDI of 0.931
Mm.
perfectly captures a nation in the awkward intermediate phase of deep systemic change. The education is secured, the access is granted, but the economic equilibrium has not yet been reached.
Wow. We have mapped an incredible multidimensional story of national triumph so far. We've seen a nation generate immense wealth.
We've seen them deploy that well to establish highly equalized health and educational systems that protect their population across class lines.
We've seen them execute a historic pivot in gender empowerment, completely rewriting their social fabric in a decade. It is a blueprint of rapid centralized human development.
It is.
But now we must turn to the final layer of data. Now the bill comes due.
And the invoice is steep.
How exactly did they build this miracle? What was the physical fuel required to push life expectancy to 79 and expected schooling to 17 years?
This brings us to the planetary reality check.
We need to circle back to the shocking statistic I mentioned in the very first minute of this deep dive, the red arrow pointing to -52.
We are looking at the Planetary Pressures Adjusted HDI, or the PHDI.
Right.
The United Nations introduced this metric because they realized that celebrating human development while ignoring the environmental destruction caused by that development was a deeply flawed, ultimately suicidal methodology.
The PHDI takes the standard triumphant human development index score and applies a harsh penalty.
Right. It discounts the score based on two specific environmental factors: a country's carbon dioxide emissions per capita and its material footprint per capita.
It essentially poses a terrifying hypothetical, If every single country on Earth developed their economy using the exact same methods you use, would the planet's biosphere survive?
And the data dictates that for Saudi Arabia, the answer is a definitive no.
No.
We establish that their standard HDI is a shining 0.9000. But when the statisticians apply the planetary pressures adjustment, that score suffers a massive collapse, falling to 0.666.
A drop from 0.900 to 0.666.
Yeah.
We really need to contextualize how brutal of a penalty that actually is. Every industrialized country takes a hit on this index, right?
Yes, of course. Development inherently requires energy and resources. When the global average HDI is adjusted for planetary pressures, the global mean shrinks by about 10%.
Okay, so a 10% shrink is the baseline cost of modern human civilization.
Right. But Saudi Arabia's HDI value doesn't shrink by 10%. It shrinks by a staggering 26%.
Oh, wow.
Their ecological penalty is more than double the global average. And it is this 26% contraction that triggers the massive 52-place drop in the global rankings, dragging them from the elite 37th position down to 89th.
We have to unpack the mechanics of this ecological debt. What specific physical realities on the ground are driving this massive 26% penalty?
Because planetary pressure sounds like an abstract, vague concept.
But the UN data measures very tangible things. Let's start with the carbon footprint.
According to the 2023 data, Saudi Arabia generates 19.9 tons of carbon dioxide emissions per capita.
19.9 tons of CO2 for every single person, every single year. How does that compare globally?
The global average is just 4.5 tons per capita.
Wow.
Saudi Arabia is emitting carbon at 4.4 times the rate of the average global citizen.
But we have to ask why. It's too easy to just point at the oil rigs. Obviously, extracting and refining oil is carbon intensive, but this is a per capita measurement of domestic pressure.
Right.
What is driving nearly 20 tons of carbon per person?
Well, you have to look at the geographical reality of sustaining a modern, very high human development society in one of the harshest desert climates on Earth.
Right.
First, consider water. A population of over 30 million people needs massive amounts of fresh water, and Saudi Arabia has virtually no permanent rivers or lakes.
So they rely entirely on massive desalination plants to turn seawater into drinking water.
And desalination is one of the most energy-intensive, carbon-heavy industrial processes on the planet.
Wow.
Second, consider temperature. Surviving and running a modern corporate economy in a climate where summer temperatures regularly exceed 110 degrees Fahrenheit requires a relentless 147 deployment of air conditioning across every home, office, and shopping center.
Add to that an infrastructure fundamentally built around the automobile, expansive urban sprawl, and massive domestic petrochemical industries, and you have a society where basic survival and economic participation require burning fossil fuels at a ferocious rate.
Yeah, and the historical data shows this isn't a new problem.
No, if you trace the data set back, you see that the carbon footprint has hovered relentlessly around that 19-ton mark consistently since 2012.
It was 19.7 tons back then. It's 19.9 tons now. The line is entirely flat.
Which is the most alarming part. A
Right.
flat line means that despite all the modernization, they haven't figured out how to decouple their economic growth from their carbon emissions.
No, the prosperity and the pollution are locked together in a 1.1 ratio.
Precisely. It is a profoundly high carbon growth model. But the carbon is only half of the PHDI penalty.
Right. The other half is material footprint.
Let's define material footprint clearly. What physical objects are actually being measured here?
The material footprint measures the total weight of raw materials extracted globally to meet the domestic consumption of a country.
Okay.
We are talking about biomass, which includes agricultural crops and forestry products, fossil fuels, metal ores like iron and copper, and non-metal minerals like sand and gravel used for concrete.
It is the literal physical weight of everything a country consumes to build its cities, feed its people, and power its infrastructure.
Exactly. And what is the weight of Saudi Arabia's consumption?
Let's see. The data reveals a material footprint of 23.5 tons of resources per capita,
23.5 tons of physical earth consumed per person.
compared to a global average of 12.7 tons. They are consuming physical resources at nearly double the global rate.
Again, we must ask why. Why double the global rate?
Because they are currently engaged in one of the most aggressive infrastructure buildouts in human history. To achieve their Vision 2030 goals, they are constructing entire megacities from scratch in the desert.
Right, they're building sprawling new transit systems, massive tourist developments, and industrial hubs.
And when you build massive concrete and steel structures in an environment that naturally provides very few of those raw materials, you have to import and consume a staggering volume of global resources.
Let's synthesize this ecological reality into an analogy to help visualize the paradox we've uncovered today.
Let's do it.
Think about the development model we've discussed as a high-speed train. Saudi Arabia spent the last 30 years engineering an incredibly luxurious, blistering fast locomotive.
And the passengers on this train, the citizens, are experiencing phenomenal conditions. They have access to state-of-the-art healthcare extending their lives.
The carriages are highly equalized. Whether you sit in the front or the back, you have guaranteed access to a 17-year educational pipeline.
Right. And after a historic policy shift, the doors between the compartments have been thrown open, allowing women to walk freely through the train, enter the workforce carriages, and even take seats in the advisory engine room.
By all human metrics, it is a marvel of modern societal engineering.
But the flaw lies in the engine itself.
Exactly.
Yeah.
To keep this massive train moving at this blistering speed, the engine is so hungry and the fuel requirement is so specific that they are leaning out the windows, ripping up the wooden tracks behind the train, and throwing them into the furnace to keep the fire burning.
Wow. They are burning their own ecological foundation to fuel their immediate prosperity.
It is a model of success that works brilliantly for the people inside the train today,
Yeah.
but it is fundamentally hostile to the landscape it is traveling through, and it destroys the path to the generations following behind.
This raises the most critical question of their 21st century trajectory. The .900 HDI is real. The health and education gains are undeniable. But the .666 PHDI is the structural warning light flashing red on the dashboard. They cannot sustain the train on this fuel source.
No.
So how do they fix it without stopping the train?
How-
Because no nation is going to voluntarily reverse its human development. They aren't going to tell their citizens, sorry, we need to close the hospitals and lower life expectancy to 68 to save the planet.
Right. Regression is politically and socially impossible. The only mathematically viable path forward, and this is the explicit stated objective of their Vision 2030 economic transition, is a concept known as decoupling.
We need to unpack decoupling because it is the holy grail of modern economics.
Historically, for the last 150 years since the Industrial Revolution, economic growth and carbon emissions were inextricably linked.
If a nation wanted to grow its GDP, it had to burn more coal, oil, or gas.
The wealth line and the emissions line on the graph always went up together. Decoupling is the technological and economic act of severing that link.
It means maintaining your high HDI growth keeping, the advanced healthcare, the expansive education, the high standard of living, while fundamentally transitioning the underlying energy infrastructure so that your carbon emissions sharply decline.
The wealth line continues to climb, but the carbon line plummets. They decouple.
But how does a nation built entirely on oil achieve that?
To improve their PHDI and close that 52-place ranking gap, they must execute a transition to green infrastructure on a scale never before attempted.
We're talking about deploying massive solar arrays across the desert to replace fossil-fueled power plants, transitioning the national fleet to electric vehicles, pioneering green hydrogen development,
And implementing circular economies where waste materials are endlessly recycled back into production to slash that 23.5-ton material footprint.
And here is the profound irony of the entire situation. They must use the immense wealth generated by the old, dirty, carbon-heavy engine to finance the research and construction of the new, clean engine. They have to use the profits of the hydrocarbon era to build the post-hydrocarbon society, all while the train is still moving at top speed.
It is the ultimate high-wire act of modern development economics.
We have covered an immense amount of ground today. Let's synthesize this journey for you, the listener.
Sounds good.
We started by looking at a jarring data paradox. A nation ranked 37th in the world for human development that suddenly plummets to 89th when you audit its environmental impact.
Through the UN data, we mapped the multidimensional reality of Saudi Arabia. We saw a nation that successfully vaulted into extreme prosperity, growing its Human Development Index by 34% in a single generation.
We saw how they utilized a massive $50,000 per capita income to establish highly equalized health and educational systems, driving life expectancy toward 80 years old and effectively buffering the population against extreme class disparity.
We witnessed a historic vertical policy pivot in 2013, structurally integrating women into the political advisory sphere and exploding the female labor force participation rate from 14% to nearly 35%.
While acknowledging the economic reality that actual paychecks and senior corporate parity still lag significantly behind the educational gains for women, representing a society in mid-transition.
And finally, we confronted the ecological bill, recognizing that this entire miraculous societal structure remains heavily anchored by massive carbon emissions and material consumption that triggers severe penalties in modern sustainability metrics.
It is a nation that has completely mastered the 20th century model of human development and is now racing against the clock to adapt to the 21st century rules of survival.
Exactly.
And that leads me to a final thought I want to leave you with today. Something to mull over long after you finish this deep dive.
What's that?
Think about this. For over a century, fossil fuels have been the primary, almost exclusive tool for nations across the globe, from the United States to Europe to the Middle East, to lift their populations out of crushing poverty, build modern hospitals, educate their children, and achieve lasting prosperity.
Hydrocarbons were the universal, undisputed engine of global progress.
But if that is true, and modern human development metrics now severely penalize the exact same mechanism that built the modern world, how do historically resource-rich developing nations redefine what progress actually looks like?
It's a huge question.
The fundamental rules of the global economic game changed halfway through their sprint to the top. If true, lasting prosperity cannot be bought by overdrawing the Earth's future ecological account, as the PhDI starkly suggests, then the next generation of human development isn't just about accumulating more wealth.
No, it's about fundamentally redefining the chemical and physical composition of wealth itself.
That is the defining challenge for the global economy in the coming decades.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the data. We hope this helped clarify the complex, sometimes contradictory, and endlessly fascinating story behind the numbers.
Keep questioning the headlines. Keep looking closely at the underlying data.
And we'll catch you on the next one.